It's the morning of March 18th, 1986. A group of children are taking a shortcut through an empty field to get to school. On the other side of that field is a road that people rarely use, and in the middle of that road, they see the body of a young woman. She's quickly identified as 24-year-old Angela Savage, whose family had reported her missing the night prior. No one had seen her or her 6-month-old baby Dween in the past 12 hours. Just 15 minutes after Angela's body is found, her baby is turned over to police. It turns out he'd spent the night on a porch in the northwest section of the city, and the people in that house actually knew Angela's family. A spokesman for the Deerfield Beach Police Department told reporters, quote, "It's probably for sure that the baby was there when this happened to his mother. But whether he was the only one to see it, we just don't know yet." Angela's mother, Josephine, also spoke to the press while cradling Dween in her arms. Quote, "The baby was very cold and sleepy. He was very hungry. He was outside all night. He's the only one who can tell us what happened. But he can't talk." Police determined that Angela had been strangled to death before her body was dumped on that deserted road. Several reports also say that she was bound and gagged, and unknown to Angela's family or the public at that time and even later on, the killer had raped Angela as well. Josephine last saw her daughter around 11 a.m. on March 17th, when Angela carried her baby to a neighborhood store to buy a pack of cigarettes. When she didn't return, Angela's brother, who lives next door, called their mother to let her know. Josephine said, quote, "When she's not going to be home, she always calls me to pick her daughter up from school. I just want to know why she didn't call me." No one knew that Angela was missing until her 5-year-old daughter came home and no one was there. She then went to her uncle's place right next door, and that's when they started calling around trying to figure out where Angela had gone. There was immediately a panic because Angela was known as a wonderful mother that would never not pick her kid up from school or just disappear when she was supposed to be somewhere. So when nighttime rolled around and Angela still hadn't returned home with her 6-month-old baby, her family knew that something was seriously wrong. And their worst fears came true when Angela's body was found the next morning at 6:15 a.m. And it led them to wonder, how was a woman murdered in broad daylight, just 2 blocks away from her home, without a single witness? As Angela's loved ones desperately waited for answers, days turned to weeks, then years. Her relatives prodded police for updates at least twice a month, and they were always left empty-handed. No updates, no significant leads, no suspects. The case was going cold. Angela's mother, Josephine, told reporters, quote, "I didn't want it to rest. I just want to ask whoever did it, why? Why did you take her life? Why did you take her away from her 2 children?" What really perplexed community members further was the fact that Angela was murdered just 2 blocks away from her home and just 1 block from her aunt's house. Her brother lived right next door to her. Angela had actually moved to Deerfield Beach when she was 13, but her family had lived in that same neighborhood for 6 decades, since 1926. On top of being one of 8 siblings, Angela also had a lot of friends. There was no one in her community or close to her that had anything against her. Authorities had ruled out everyone with close ties to Angela, including her boyfriend that she lived with, the father of her 6-month-old baby Dween. Now I want to fast forward to 8 years after the murder. With nowhere to go from here, the authorities had to turn to the public for help. The Broward Sheriff's Office wanted to get as many eyes on the case as possible, so they did something they had never even heard of themselves. They bought space on a billboard in town. In bold lettering, it asked, "Who murdered Angela Savage?" with a phone number for tips and a notice of a reward. Angela's father commented that the billboard was, quote, "a cry for help from our family. We're appealing to our community. We really think something positive will come from this." Her mother also added, "I know someone saw what happened. I know someone knows. It's just they don't want to talk. Now maybe they will. We'd feel better if justice was done. In the fall of 1994, Lieutenant Tony Fantagrassi was head of the cold case squad that reopened Angela's murder case. He said, quote, "What we're really trying to do is to get as many people involved in this community as we can. We felt that the killer also was a part of the community and still lives there. We kicked around a lot of ideas. In these kinds of cases, you're only limited to your imagination. I find it very hard to believe this murder was committed without someone knowing something about it. I think somebody knows. This girl has not been forgotten. This case has not been forgotten." This new billboard did spark renewed interest in the case, but no one came forward with valuable information. We're going to jump ahead a few years later to November of 1997. The South Florida Sun-Sentinel re-examined this case, titling their story in big bold letters, "Who Killed Angela Savage?" And this article was written by Lisa J. Harish. Quote, "She comes to him in his dreams with that smile, radiant and unforgettable. It is always a shock. 'What are you doing here?' he demands. 'You're supposed to be dead.' 'Well, I'm here,' Angela Savage tells her brother. 'Who killed you?' Daryl Adams asks in a panic. 'Tell me who did this to you.' She begins to respond. Her mouth is forming words. And then Adam wakes, without an answer to the question that has haunted the family for 11 years. 'Somebody knows,' Adams said. 'This person could be looking at us in our face every day.'" The brutal strangulation of Savage, 24, is Deerfield Beach's most infamous unsolved murder case. It drew statewide attention because detectives used an unusual method. A taxpayer-funded roadside billboard that read, "Who murdered Angela Savage?" This next section of the article is where I learned a lot of new details about what happened the day Angela was murdered. Details that had not been reported on at all until this point, 11 years later. And maybe it was mentioned somewhere that isn't available in the newspaper archives, but one of the details is that Angela was actually pregnant when she was killed. I believe around 4 months pregnant. And that factor becomes more important to authorities much later on. Back to the article. The case stumped police because there were few clues to lead them to a killer. For Mike Bowl, the lead detective in the case, the unsolved murder is the biggest disappointment of his career. "We have nothing you can sink your teeth into," said Bowl, a detective with the Broward Sheriff's Office. "We've had a handful of leads, baloney leads. You would expect the phone to be ringing off the hook. This much is certain. Savage was living with her 2 children, a 5-year-old girl and 6-month-old boy, and the children's father. On a cold March morning in 1986, while her mate was at work at a marble company, Savage pleaded with her daughter, Stacy, to get out of bed and go to school. Stacy cried that she wanted to stay home. But Savage, who was pregnant, got her off to school. Then she walked to a neighborhood store with her infant son, Dwayne, to buy a pack of cigarettes. She left food in the sink and her television on The Young and the Restless. On the way back from the store, witnesses saw a man approach her on the street and make sexual advances. Savage told him to leave her alone and continued on her way. Police are not sure whether she knew the man. She was found dead about 6:15 a.m. the next morning in the 100 block of Southeast 4th Street in Deerfield Beach. Quote, "A location where she is meant to be found. It's a path school kids use," Bull said. The tiny dirt path is well traveled, mostly by locals. It was where Savage had walked to classes as a middle school student with her brothers. 15 minutes after her body was found, police learned her son had been left on the porch of family friends nearby. Deerfield Beach police determined she had been strangled. They think she knew her killer. The city closed its police department in 1990 and turned law enforcement, along with all of the department's cold cases, over to the sheriff's office. Savage's family and the detectives who took over the case were convinced that someone in the community knew or had seen something that could help them solve the murder. So they posted the 12 by 25-foot billboard on Dixie Highway asking for help. It cost the sheriff's office $887 to enlarge the photographs for the billboard and $1,500 to use the billboard for 1 year. Detectives received only 5 tips in those 12 months. They were shocked. Bull had counted on the billboard generating leads. "I sure as hell thought it would give me a direction," he said. "This was something new, and we were putting it up in an area where people would see it. They'd be talking about it. We were overly confident. It's not so much frustrating, just disheartening." Savage's brother, Ronnie Savage, turned his head when he passed the sign. It broke his heart. Her brother, Wayne Adams, said he'd never lost hope, even when the sign started fading. The family and police have a few reasons for thinking the killer knew his victim. He left her body where she would certainly be found, not in a trash bin or canal. Bull thinks the killer cared about her. Also, the baby boy was left at a doorstep of family friends. "She was born, raised here, lived here, and died here," said Bull. "The answers are here too, but I could be 100% wrong. It could be a drifter." At the reception after the funeral, someone in the steady stream of people who passed through her parents' unlocked front door left Savage's gold sandals in a paper bag by a living room lamp. Scared and upset at the package's mysterious appearance, her mother tossed the shoes in the garbage can. A move police would later tell her was a mistake. When Savage's body was found, she was barefoot. She could have been wearing the sandals when she was killed. Despite the scarcity of evidence, the police and the family still have hopes of solving the murder. "With time, a case gets better," Bull said. "We compare it to fine wine, because people's relationships change. Something prompts someone to pick up the phone or say something to someone. You want to rat on your boyfriend? You want to make a deal? Great. This case is collecting dust." And while some family members still awake in the middle of the night, shaking and crying and thinking of Angela, they have come to grips with their loss. "Most of us wanted revenge back then. Now we want justice," Daryl Adams said. "The family waits, still hoping someone will call detectives with that crucial tip. If I ever find them, I want to ask one question." "Why?" said Josephine Adams, Savage's mother. "Why did they kill her?" The family and loved ones of Angela Savage would eventually get that answer, but not until another decade had passed. In March of 2006, authorities reopened the investigation once again on the 20-year anniversary. They had more resources now that were vital to cracking a cold case. Specifically, they could now compare DNA evidence. Authorities had already run the DNA evidence through a database at least once, unsuccessfully. But when they ran it again in June of 2007, this time it came back with a match: 46-year-old Gary Troutman. The revelation was shocking. Not only did Troutman grow up with Angela, attending the same school and church, he'd already been convicted of a murder strikingly similar to this case. We have to go back to February 1986, just a month before Angela Savage was murdered. On the morning of February 5th, a warehouse owner going to work stumbled upon the body of 17-year-old Cassandra Scott. She was fully clothed, lying on the ground near a wall off the 700 block of Northwest 1st Ave. Like Angela Savage, Cassandra was young, black, and about 4 months pregnant. Their bodies were actually found just half a mile apart. If police had connected the dots, Gary Troutman may have been arrested much sooner, but there was a critical mistake. An autopsy listed Cassandra Scott's cause of death as undetermined. Without documentation that her death was a homicide, authorities couldn't or wouldn't pursue an investigation. Meanwhile, her family knew all along that this was not an accident. Someone took Cassandra's life. Her aunt told the Miami Herald, quote, "Cassandra was a sweet young girl. She wasn't sickly. The whole family thought she was murdered, but there was nothing going on." And it wasn't authorities who cracked this case and figured out that she was murdered or figured out who the killer was. It was the killer's own guilt that ultimately led him to confess after holding on to it for 8 years. This article from the Miami Herald, written by Trish Power, is chilling to read, knowing that police had no idea they'd also caught Angela Savage's killer. I guess Troutman's guilt didn't extend that far. June 18th, 1994. Confession sheds light on mysterious 86 death. Conscious got better of a man, BSO detectives say. Gary Troutman couldn't stand the nightmares anymore. Sitting there at the police station, accused of hitting his wife, he started talking about a young pregnant Deerfield woman he'd killed 8 years ago. Deputies didn't remember the victim. There was no such unsolved case. No outstanding murder warrant. Better check it out, they said. Call in the cold case squad. Detective Steve Wiley got used to his telephone ringing at all hours when he worked homicide for the Broward Sheriff's Office. Since joining the cold case unit, phone calls generally came during office hours, and so it was with some surprise that Wiley answered his phone at 5:30 a.m. one morning last week. A sergeant in BSO's Deerfield Beach office told him about a guy they'd picked up for domestic battery. A guy who, all of a sudden, started talking about this old murder case. I went down there, advised him of his rights, Wiley said. He starts telling me of a homicide that he and his wife committed. Wiley listened. Troutman, 32, told how he was always fascinated by the mob. He and his wife, Katrina, liked TV shows about the mafia. They talked for weeks about wanting to do a hit like the mob, police said. He was obsessed by the mob, Wiley said. On February 5th, 1986, they decided to carry it out. Katrina Troutman lured Cassandra Scott, 4 months pregnant, into the house, saying they had some baby clothes for her. The women were looking at the clothes when Troutman came up from behind and strangled Scott. She collapsed. Then they smothered the young woman, who was wearing jeans with little buttons on the legs, Troutman told police. Hours later, they borrowed a car to remove the body. He said they had to tie the trunk down because they couldn't close it, Wiley said. Why? He asked. She was stiff, Troutman told him. They left the body on a little patch of grass near a warehouse in the 700 block of Northwest 1st Terrace, he said. The body was discovered the next morning by Lucius Troutman, Gary Troutman's older brother, and the father of the victim's half-brothers. An autopsy was performed. The cause of death, undetermined. Deerfield Beach police filed the case away. Scott's family was filled with disbelief that a healthy young woman could just up and die. Cassandra Scott was buried. Her family continued to wonder why she died. Every day and every night I think about my sister, said Sharonda Allen, 14. Nobody ever found out what happened to her. The Troutmans slipped away to Georgia. They returned a few weeks ago, and all the while, Troutman was tormented. He had been wanting to confess for some time. He'd been having nightmares, Wiley said. The last one came days before his confession. He dreamed she was in the coffin and she was pregnant. So when Troutman was arrested June 8, 1994 by Broward Sheriff's deputies on charges of domestic battery, he spilled his guts. Wiley had a murder suspect, without a murder case. It wasn't ever carried as a homicide, Wiley said. It is so aggravating reading this article with the hindsight that we have with police acting like nothing matched this case, when Angela Savage's murder was a cold case in their files, and they'd actually reopen her case just a few months after Gary Troutman's arrest, with a huge billboard asking who murdered Angela Savage. For anyone in the department that knew the details of Angela Savage's murder, Cassandra Scott's murder, anyone would wonder if those cases were possibly connected. There's more details that are alike than different. Back to the article. Wiley dug the case file out of city and county archives. He found photographs of a young woman, wearing jeans with little buttons on the legs, lying on a patch of grass near some warehouses. I was amazed, Wiley said. This is the first time I've taken a confession to a case I knew nothing about. Detectives gave the case file to Broward medical examiner Dr. Joshua Perper and asked for an opinion, without telling him its history. Homicide, he said. Gary Troutman, who was already in the Broward County Jail on battery charges, has been charged with first-degree murder. Katrina Troutman, arrested on a warrant for bad checks, is also in the Broward County Jail. She denies any involvement in Scott's murder. The investigation into her role is continuing. Honestly, I call bullshit on Gary Troutman's entire story. Either his wife knew about what happened and he was scared that she was going to turn him in after he beat her. But another theory is, I think he used this idea of being obsessed with the mob to cover up his actual fantasy, brutally raping and killing young black pregnant girls. His own wife was subjected to his violence, and I find it hard to believe that she would participate in that odd, elaborate scheme to kill an innocent girl that she probably knew, considering Gary Troutman was related to her half-brother's father, or if she didn't know the victim, just a girl who's walking down the street, not bothering anyone. I think the more likely scenario is that Troutman made sexual advances at Cassandra, and when rejected, he decided to kill her, just like he did with Angela Savage a month later. Even though Troutman says it's his guilt that led him to confess, I think he actually enjoyed those nightmares, because it allowed him to relive the murder. Maybe after 8 years, he was starting to forget all the details of what he did. And maybe he wanted to talk about it and relive Cassandra's murders so desperately, he talked himself into a hole and revealed way too much, leaving no question that he was definitely involved. Or again, like I said, his wife knew that he had killed someone and he thought she was going to turn him in. So he had to make up this mob fantasy and make up this story that she was in on it too, to further distance himself from the fact that he was the killer. Because if guilt was the actual cause for Gary Troutman's confession, why didn't he also confess to Angela Savage's murder? For the murder of Cassandra Scott, Gary Troutman was sentenced to 25 years in prison. He served less than half, just 9 years, before his early release in 2005. A year later, he battered and threatened his girlfriend, landing him in jail once again. Shortly after his release in 2007, they finally got a match with his DNA. An officer spotted Troutman sleeping in Washington Park and made the arrest. When news broke about the arrest in a decades-old murder case, and before police confirmed the evidence that was used to catch him, one of Angela's brothers revealed it was through DNA testing. He told a reporter, quote, "She was raped and they matched his DNA. After 21 years, I'm just now learning she was raped. I never knew that. It was hard for Angela's family to grapple with the fact that this was someone their family had known for decades, and that he would target Angela out of all people. One of her brothers recalled, quote, "She would give you the shirt off her back, and if you called on her, she would always be there. She was just a good sister." The Troutman family attended the same church as Angela's. She and Troutman were the same age and attended the same high school, Deerfield Beach High. Angela also grew up with Troutman's wife, Katrina, and knew her well. Angela befriended one of her killer's nieces, and her father knew several of the killer's brothers. Her mother, Josephine, also recalled Troutman coming to their neighborhood as a teenager. Quote, "As a kid, you could see him outside with the girls. Whoever thought something would happen like this?" Angela's children had to grow up without a mother, and with the knowledge that her killer was still out there, probably still living in their community. The arrest of her killer 21 years later was a relief, but it couldn't reverse the damage that had already been done. By this point, Dween was still living in Deerfield Beach, apparently working for a landscaping company, but his sister, Stacy, had been long gone. The older she got, the more she wanted to leave Deerfield Beach, the town where people largely saw her as just the daughter of a woman who was brutally murdered, the most notable cold case murder in town. Stacy recalled, quote, "I don't know if people really understand that, especially as I got older. I just really wanted to disconnect from that scene as much as I could. I wanted to be me. There's not a day that goes by that something doesn't remind you that you don't have a mom." Despite this horrific situation that Stacy and her brother were thrust into, Stacy actually went on to graduate from Clark Atlanta University with a master's degree, and by this point, in her mid-20s, had already purchased her own home, which is a hard thing to do for anyone, especially someone who suffered so much tragedy at such a young age. Gary Troutman was initially charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and rape, but the case kept getting pushed back. According to one of Angela's brothers, quote, "He spent 8 years in the county, playing the justice system like he was crazy, mentally insane." Apparently, Troutman kept delaying the case, going through a string of lawyers and experts who had to determine if he was competent to stand trial. It's really hard to prosecute a murder from 20 plus years ago alone, but on top of that, the Supreme Court had recently overturned a conviction with DNA evidence. Prosecutors didn't want to jeopardize their case, so they went to the defense with a deal. Not only did they drop the kidnapping and rape charges, they dropped the murder charge down to second-degree murder. On July 16th, 2015, the day finally came for Troutman to face a judge and the family of Angela Savage, who gave victim impact statements in court. Her brother Wayne recalled that she had planned on marrying her boyfriend, the father of her young son, and that was just one of many things that her killer took away from her. He said, quote, "Mr. Troutman, you stole her dreams. We will never see her wedding now. My family will never be the same. Angela's death is like a deep wound that will never heal." A lot of people believed that Angela's boyfriend was responsible for her murder because it went unsolved for so long, and he knew that people saw him as that suspect, and it really broke his heart because obviously he had nothing to do with it. And unfortunately, he passed away a couple years before Gary Troutman's arrest, though he never got to see Angela's killer get arrested. Angela's brother Daryl's statement was also mentioned in the newspaper. Quote, "Gary Troutman caused a lot of pain and tears to my entire family. We will never get over that pain and hurt. I forgive him, but I will never forget the hurt he has caused my family. And I hope he never gets out of prison alive." When Angela's mother addressed the court, she talked about how they shared the same birthday, June 26, and for the past 3 decades, he's had to celebrate without her. And quote, "I'm just glad to be here to see this day. Today it will be over. She will rest in peace now. She is in a better place now than he is, because he has to take his punishment, and I won't have to cry anymore. I will cry when the birthdays come. I know I can't bring her back. I'm just glad she's at peace now." That atmosphere of peace that Angela Savage's family and Cassandra Scott's family had would ultimately be broken when they received a letter from the Florida Department of Corrections in October 2022, 7 years after Gary Troutman was sentenced. It was a courtesy notice of Gary Troutman's release from prison within the next 90 days. When Gary Troutman was sentenced, there wasn't a rule in place at the time that is now in place where a murderer has to serve out their entire sentence. And because it took so long for the trial to go on, Gary had already spent 8 years in jail and then served 7 more years in prison. So in total, he had served half of his 30-year sentence, allowing his early release. Even after murdering 2 young pregnant women in cold blood, Gary Troutman was allowed to walk free once again. Angela's brother wanted to warn the community, so he wrote a letter to the South Florida Sun. Quote, "People need to know a cold-blooded killer is going to be released back into the community. He might be out around Christmas time. I think he was born evil. I really do. He's going to kill someone again. That old Satan is going to rise out of him again." A couple years ago, some of Angela Savage's brothers actually did a video/podcast about their sister's killer's upcoming release and how they felt about that. Here are some clips from that YouTube video, and if you want to watch the entire thing, there will be a link in the description.
He's a sick individual. A sick individual. And would you want this person living in your neighborhood? How he stalked Cassandra. He never admitted to on audio that he killed our sister. But our sister was murdered the very same way with a necktie, dumped side the road by him. He admitted to doing it because they know that this animal should still be in prison on death row. But right now, he's a free serial killer out on the streets, could kill at any moment now. And our job is to inform the public of where he's at, where he's going to be, and make his life uncomfortable.
Gary Troutman was officially released on December 1st, 2022, at the age of 63. The address he gave corrections is just outside Atlanta in East Point, Georgia. Quick shout out to the new lovely accomplices right here. We have Jigsaw's, Emmeline, Sad Sock, Kai, and Solaya Elizabeth. If you want to be like these people and get ad-free, sometimes early episodes, and a shout out at the end of the podcast, make sure you check out my Patreon. It is only $1 a month. I'm trying to build an army of accomplices. We're almost to 100. I think I'm going to end the episode here. My thoughts are, how the fuck is this man allowed to walk around free? At least just take a very good look at his face and be aware. Be aware that this man is walking around, potentially in Georgia, a man who's not only murdered 2 young pregnant women, but also someone who's shown no remorse at all. And actually, when he was led away to prison after being sentenced, Angela Savage's family called him an animal, and his response was to turn around and smirk. So yeah, that's the kind of world we're living in. Obviously, our criminal justice system failed. Angela Savage's family failed Cassandra Scott's family, and could potentially fail another human being because Angela's brothers believe that this man will kill again. I'm going to end it here. If you listened all the way through, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you all have a good day, evening, or night. Goodbye.